There's something about a mother protecting her young that touches the deepest part of our hearts. When that mother is abandoned and left to face death alone, it breaks something inside us that can't easily be mended. In the frozen wilderness of Wyoming, a mare stands over her two newborn foals in a howling blizzard. They've been left to die by the man who once called them his own. Hours pass. The snow builds higher around their trembling bodies. Death circles closer with every gust of wind. Then, through the white veil of the storm, a lone cowboy appears. Cole Hart is a drifter with nothing to his name but the horse beneath him and the coat on his back. He could ride past. Most men would. But when he sees those three souls fighting for their last breath, something stirs in his weathered heart. What he doesn't know is that saving them will cost him everything he has left. But would you walk away from a mother and her babies dying in the snow? Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. The storm lantern flickered against the cabin window, casting long shadows across the worn wooden floor where Cole Hart sat alone. Outside, the Wyoming wind howled through the pines like a wounded animal, but inside, the silence felt heavier than the snow pressing against the roof. Cole's calloused hands turned another page of his leather journal, the binding cracked and soft from years of handling. The entries went back 15 years, chronicling a life that had taken more turns than a mountain trail. December 10th, 1887. Emma laughed today when she saw the first snow, said it looked like sugar falling from heaven. How do children see magic where we only see hardship? Cole's thumb traced the faded ink. Emma would have been 7 then, all pigtails and gap-toothed grins, following him around their homestead in Kansas like a devoted shadow. His wife, Margaret, had written that entry in her careful script while he was out checking the cattle. She always did have a poet's way with words, finding beauty in the smallest moments. He turned the page, skipping past entries that still cut too deep to read. The cabin around him told the story of a man who had retreated from the world. Built with his own hands 3 years ago, it sat in a valley so remote that even the wind seemed surprised to find it. No neighbors for 20 miles, no roads that deserved the name, just a narrow trail that Cole kept deliberately overgrown. The nearest town, Millbrook, might as well have been in another territory for all the connection he maintained with civilization. The journal fell open to a page he hadn't intended to find. Margaret's handwriting again, dated just 2 months before the fever took them both. Cole speaks of moving west, says there's opportunity in the territories. I told him home isn't a place, it's the people you love. But I see the restlessness in his eyes. He's got the soul of a wanderer, even if his heart belongs to us. She'd been right, as always. After they died, first Emma, then Margaret. Just days later, he'd sold everything and headed west like a man possessed. Except he wasn't seeking opportunity. He was running from ghosts that followed him anyway, settling into his bones like winter cold. The lantern flame guttered, bringing him back to the present. Cole closed the journal and set it on the rough-hewn table beside his chair. The cabin wasn't much. One room with a stone fireplace, a sleeping area curtained off with an old quilt, and shelves lined with practical necessities. No photographs, no mementos, nothing that might stir memories he worked hard to keep buried. Just the journal, which he kept out of habit more than sentiment. Outside, his horse Buck nickered softly from the lean-to shelter Cole had built against the cabin's north wall. Buck was getting old, 22 if Cole's math was right, with a grey muzzle and the kind of steady temperament that came from years of hard country. They understood each other, he and Buck. Both were creatures of routine, content with simple needs and the kind of solitude that came not from choice but from necessity. Cole had been a different man once. Back in Kansas, he'd been the neighbor folks called on when their horses took sick or their cattle needed working. He had a gift with animals, Margaret used to say, a patience and gentleness that made them trust him. Children too, Emma's friends would cluster around him whenever he came to town, begging for stories or rides on his shoulders. He'd been anchored then, rooted in purpose and love. The wind died for a moment, and in the sudden quiet, Cole heard Buck shifting restlessly outside. The horse had been acting strange all evening, ears pricked forward toward the pass that led down to Millbrook. Animals knew things, sensed changes in weather and mood that humans missed. Cole had learned to pay attention to such signs. He stood and walked to the window, cupping his hands around his eyes to peer through the frost-covered glass. The storm that had been threatening all day was finally moving in, great grey clouds rolling over the peaks like smoke from some distant fire. Snow was already beginning to fall, fat flakes that caught the lantern light and disappeared into the darkness beyond. This would be a hard one. Cole could feel it in his bones, the way old injuries ached before weather turned severe. The temperature had been dropping all week, and now the wind was shifting to come straight down from the north. The kind of storm that could bury a man if he wasn't careful, that could turn familiar country into a white maze where even experienced travelers lost their way. He should check on Buck, make sure the shelter was secure, and that there was enough feed and water for whatever was coming. But something kept him at the window, watching the snow begin to thicken. Maybe it was the restlessness Margaret had written about, the wanderer's soul that even 3 years of self-imposed exile couldn't quite still. Or maybe it was simply the knowledge that storms like this changed things, shifted the landscape in ways that went deeper than mere accumulation of snow. Cole pulled on his coat and stepped outside. The cold hit him like a physical blow, stealing his breath and making his eyes water. The snow was falling harder now, driven by gusts that sent it swirling in all directions. He could barely see the dark bulk of the mountains that surrounded his valley, their peaks lost in low-hanging clouds. Buck whinnied when he saw him, pressing his muzzle against Cole's shoulder in a gesture that was part greeting, part complaint about the weather. Cole stroked the horse's neck, feeling the tension in the old animal's muscles. "Easy, boy," he murmured. "Just a storm. We've weathered worse." But even as he said it, Cole felt the lie in his words. This wasn't just weather, it was the kind of storm that tested everything, that found the weak places in a man's defenses and pressed until something gave way. He'd lived through enough hard winters to recognize the signs, the way the wind carried an edge that cut through even the thickest clothes, the particular quality of the cold that seemed to seep into your bones and settle there like a permanent ache. He secured the lean-to's door and made sure Buck had plenty of feed and unfrozen water. The horse would be fine. Cole had built the shelter to withstand anything the mountains could deliver. It was people caught out in weather like this who faced real danger. People with no place to go, no warm shelter waiting at the end of a hard trail. Back inside the cabin, Cole sat down with his journal once more. The pages fell open to an entry from his first winter in the valley, when the isolation had nearly driven him back to civilization. January 15th, 1890. Been 2 months since I've seen another human soul, starting to talk to Buck like he might answer back. Maybe that's not madness. Maybe that's just what happens when a man realizes the only conversation worth having is with creatures who understand suffering without needing to name it. He'd written those words during a blizzard, much like this one, when the snow had piled so high around the cabin that he'd had to dig his way out just to reach Buck. For 3 days, the world had disappeared into white noise and howling wind, and Cole had faced the possibility that he might die alone in this valley he'd chosen as his refuge. But he'd survived, as he'd survived everything else life had thrown at him. Not because he was particularly strong or brave, but because survival had become a habit, a reflex honed by years of loss and disappointment. He'd learned to endure, to find small purposes that got him through each day, without looking too far ahead or too far behind. The lantern flame danced as another gust rattled the cabin walls. Cole closed the journal and prepared for bed, banking the fire and checking that his provisions were within easy reach. Tomorrow, if the storm passed, he'd ride down to check his trap lines and maybe make the monthly trip to Millbrook for supplies. Simple routines that marked the passage of time without demanding too much of his carefully guarded heart. But tonight, as the wind gathered strength and the snow began to pile against his door, Cole Hart had no way of knowing that morning would bring a choice that would shatter his carefully constructed solitude. That 3 lives would depend on the very qualities Margaret had seen in him all those years ago, the patience and gentleness that made broken creatures trust him with their pain. The storm lantern burned through the night, a small beacon of warmth in the vast cold wilderness, waiting to guide him toward a purpose he thought he'd buried with his family in Kansas soil. Dawn came grey and muffled, filtered through clouds so thick they seemed to press against the earth itself. Cole woke to the sound of wind that had shifted from howl to moan, the kind of weather voice that meant business. 3 feet of snow had fallen in the night, and it was still coming down in sheets so dense he could barely make out Buck's shelter 30 yards from the cabin. He should have stayed inside. Any man with sense would have banked his fire higher and waited for the storm to blow itself out. But Buck was restless again, pacing in his shelter and nickering toward the pass. And Cole had learned to trust his horse's instincts more than his own comfort. The cold hit him like a hammer blow when he stepped outside, 20 below, maybe colder with the wind. His breath froze in his beard before he'd taken 3 steps. The snow came at him sideways, stinging his eyes and finding every gap in his clothing despite the layers he'd wrapped around himself like armor against the weather. Buck was definitely agitated now, pawing at the ground and tossing his head toward the narrow trail that led up through the pass. The horse's ears were pricked forward, focused on something Cole couldn't see or hear over the storm's voice. "What is it, boy?" Cole's words were snatched away by the wind almost before he spoke them. He saddled Buck with numb fingers, the leather stiff as iron in the cold. The horse stood patient as stone while Cole worked, but Cole could feel the tension thrumming through the animal's frame. Buck knew something was wrong out there in the white wilderness. Animals always knew. The trail up to the pass was nearly invisible, marked only by the memory of familiar landmarks now buried under snow. Cole let Buck pick the way, trusting the horse's sure footing and instincts while he hunched forward in the saddle, trying to present less surface area to the driving wind. Each gust felt like it might lift him bodily from Buck's back and send him tumbling into the white void that had swallowed the world. They climbed for what felt like hours, but was probably less than one, the storm making time and distance impossible to judge. The pass was a shallow saddle between 2 peaks, usually an easy ride but treacherous in weather like this. Cole had been foolish to attempt it, but Buck's urgency had infected him, stirring something that might have been intuition or might have been the restless spirit Margaret had written about in her journal. At the crest of the pass, Buck stopped abruptly and stood stone still, his head raised and nostrils flared. Cole squinted through the snow, trying to see whatever had caught the horse's attention. For a moment, there was nothing but white chaos. Then the wind died for just an instant, and Cole saw them. A dark shape against the snow, too regular to be a rock, too still to be alive. But as Cole urged Buck closer, the shape resolved into something that made his heart skip. A horse, a mare, standing with her head down and her legs braced wide. Snow piled so high around her that she looked like a statue carved from the storm itself. And beneath her, barely visible in the hollow, her body heat had melted in the snow, 2 tiny forms that might have been stones or fallen branches, until one of them moved. Cole was off Buck's back before he'd consciously decided to dismount. The snow came up past his knees as he struggled toward the mare, each step a fight against the wind and the deep powder that wanted to swallow him whole. The cold bit through his gloves and boots, but he barely felt it now. The mare lifted her head as he approached, and Cole saw exhaustion and desperation in her dark eyes. She was a sorrel with a white blaze, maybe 15 hands high, built for endurance rather than speed. Her coat was ice-crusted, and she was shivering despite the thick winter hair. but she held her ground over the two foals, huddled between her legs, a living shield against the storm that was slowly killing them all. "Easy, girl," Cole murmured, extending his hand slowly. "Easy now." The mare's ears flicked toward him, but she didn't move away. She was too exhausted to run, too frozen to do anything but stand and hope for mercy from whatever force had brought her to this pass. Cole could see her ribs through her winter coat, could count each labored breath that steamed briefly in the frigid air before being swept away by the wind. The foals were worse. Newborns, maybe days old, with the gangly proportions and uncertain movements of babies still learning their legs. One was a chestnut like his mother, the other darker, maybe a bay or brown. They were pressed tight against the mare's belly, seeking what warmth they could find, but Cole could see they were losing the fight. Ice crystals clung to their muzzles, and their breathing was shallow and rapid. Lying in the snow beside them, half buried by the storm, was a leather halter. Cole picked it up with numb fingers, noting the quality of the workmanship and the brass nameplate that read "Moonlight." But the halter had been cut, not unbuckled. The leather showed knife marks where someone had sliced through the straps in haste. Someone had abandoned them here, left a pregnant mare to foal in the wilderness, then cut her loose when the weather turned bad. Cole felt anger kindle in his chest, a heat that had nothing to do with the cold pressing in around them. But anger was a luxury he couldn't afford, not with 3 lives hanging in the balance and the storm showing no signs of letting up. The mare and foals would be dead within hours if he left them here, maybe sooner. Cole looked back toward Buck, standing patient in the swirling snow. The old horse couldn't carry all of them, and the foals were too weak to walk far in this weather. But his cabin was only 2 miles away, down the backside of the pass and through the valley. 2 miles that might as well be 200 in a blizzard like this. The mare watched him with liquid brown eyes that held the intelligence he recognized. She knew she was dying, knew her babies were dying too. But she also sensed something in Cole's presence, some possibility of salvation she was too weary to hope for, but couldn't quite dismiss. "I'm going to get you out of here," Cole told her, his words half lost in the wind. "All 3 of you." He didn't know how, didn't have a plan beyond the simple certainty that he couldn't leave them to freeze. Emma had been the same age as these foals when she died, not from cold but from fever, but the helplessness felt identical. The sense of time running out like sand through an hourglass. Cole began by breaking trail, using his body to pack down the snow between the mare and Buck. Each step was a battle against the wind and the deep powder that wanted to drag him down. His boots filled with snow despite the gaiters he'd wrapped around his legs, and ice began forming in his beard and eyebrows. The mare followed him hesitantly at first, then with growing trust as she realized he was leading her toward some kind of shelter. The foals struggled behind her, their legs disappearing into the snow with each step. The darker one stumbled and went down, too weak to regain his footing in the deep powder. Cole scooped the foal up in his arms, feeling how light and fragile the little body was, how the rapid heartbeat fluttered against his chest like a trapped bird. The foal was barely warm, his temperature dropping toward the point where his body would simply stop trying to maintain life. The other foal collapsed before they'd gone 50 yards. Cole found himself carrying both babies, one tucked under each arm, while the mare followed behind like a ghost in the swirling snow. Buck brought up the rear, the old horse somehow understanding the urgency without needing guidance. They moved in single file down the treacherous backside of the pass, Cole breaking trail by pure force of will, while the storm tried to erase their steps as fast as he could make them. Time became meaningless in the white chaos. Cole's world narrowed to the next step, the next breath, the precious burden he carried against his chest. The foals had stopped shivering, which was worse than the shaking had been. When hypothermia progressed that far, the body was beginning to shut down, conserving heat for the vital organs in a last desperate attempt at survival. The mare stumbled and nearly went down on a steep section of trail. Cole turned back to help her, shifting the Foals to free one arm. She leaned against him for a moment, her great head resting on his shoulder, and he felt her exhaustion like a physical weight. But she found her footing again and kept moving, driven by the same maternal instinct that had kept her standing over her babies in the storm. Cole's cabin finally materialized out of the snow like a mirage, solid and real and impossibly welcome. The storm lantern still burned in the window, a golden beacon that guided them the last 100 yards through drifts that came up to Cole's waist. He'd never been so grateful to see those rough log walls, that familiar door that promised warmth and safety and a chance at life for the 3 souls who'd trusted him to lead them home. The abandoned halter lay forgotten in the snow where Cole had dropped it, already being covered by the relentless storm. But the knife cuts in the leather told their own story of callousness and abandonment, of lives discarded when they became inconvenient. Cole would remember that halter in the days to come, when questions arose about ownership and rights and the legal complexities of saving lives that someone else had thrown away. But for now, all that mattered was getting them inside, getting them warm, giving them the chance to fight for another day. The storm lantern flickered as he shouldered open the cabin door, but it didn't go out. Like hope itself, it kept burning through the darkness, waiting to light whatever came next. The warmth of the cabin hit Cole like a benediction after the brutal cold of the storm. But there was no time to savor the relief. The foals hung limp in his arms, their breathing so shallow he had to put his ear to their muzzles to be sure they were still alive. The mare stood in his doorway, snow melting from her coat in rivulets that pooled on his wooden floor, her legs trembling with exhaustion and cold. Cole lowered the foals gently onto the thick rug beside his fireplace, then turned to build up the fire that had burned low in his absence. His hands shook as he fed split pine to the flames, whether from cold or something deeper he couldn't say. The sight of those tiny bodies, so still and fragile, stirred memories he'd worked hard to bury. Emma had been small like that once. Not a foal, but a human baby who'd fit in the crook of his arm, whose heartbeat had fluttered against his chest when she was sick with fever. The parallel was too sharp, too immediate. He pushed it aside and focused on the work at hand. The mare needed attention too, but she was stronger, more likely to survive the next few hours. The foals were balanced on the knife's edge between life and death, their body temperatures so low that warming them too quickly could stop their hearts. Cole had seen it with cattle caught in late blizzards. The shock of sudden heat could be as deadly as the cold itself. He moved them closer to the fire, but not directly in front of it, then began the careful process of raising their core temperature degree by degree. Blankets first, the heavy wool ones he used for his own bedding. Then towels, heated by the fire, wrapped around their necks and bellies, where the major blood vessels ran close to the surface. He massaged their legs gently, trying to restore circulation without causing more stress to their struggling systems. The chestnut foal, the stronger of the two, began to stir after an hour of patient work. His breathing deepened, and Cole felt the tiny heartbeat grow more regular under his palm. The darker foal took longer, his life force flickering like a candle in wind. But gradually, incrementally, warmth began to return to his small body. The mare watched everything from her position near the door, too exhausted to move further into the cabin, but alert to every touch Cole bestowed on her babies. When he looked up at her, Cole saw something in her eyes that went beyond animal instinct. Recognition, maybe. Gratitude, the kind of intelligence that understood rescue when it came, even from an unexpected source. "You need food," Cole told her, his voice rusty from the cold and exertion. "And water, but warm, not cold enough to shock your system." He heated water on his wood stove, testing it with his elbow, the way Margaret had taught him when Emma was small. Body temperature, no warmer. Too hot, and it could cause cramping. Too cold, and it wouldn't help raise her core temperature. The mare drank carefully at first, then with growing eagerness as her body recognized what it needed. Hay was harder. Coal stores were meant for Buck alone, carefully calculated to last through the worst of winter. But he couldn't let the mare starve, not after bringing her this far. He gave her the best of what he had, the sweet meadow grass he'd cut from the high valleys in late summer. She ate with the focused intensity of an animal who hadn't seen quality feed in days. As the hours passed and the storm continued to rage outside, Cole found himself settling into a rhythm of care that felt both foreign and familiar. Check the foals' breathing and temperature. Rotate their positions so they warmed evenly. Massage their legs and necks to keep circulation flowing. Feed the mare. Give her water. Talk to her in the low, soothing voice that seemed to calm her nervousness. It was late afternoon when the chestnut foal tried to stand for the first time. His legs folded under him immediately, too weak to support even his tiny weight, but the effort itself was encouraging. Life was returning, fighting its way back from the edge of oblivion. The darker foal took another hour, but eventually he too began showing signs of awareness, lifting his head and looking around with curious, dark eyes. The mare nickered softly when she saw her babies moving, a sound that vibrated with relief and hope. She tried to approach them, but Cole held up a gentle hand. "Not yet, girl. Let them get stronger first. You'll step on them if you try to mother them before they can get out of the way." But as evening approached and the foals began to show real signs of recovery, Cole allowed the mare to come closer. She sniffed each baby carefully, then began the delicate process of cleaning them with her tongue, the same instinctive grooming that would have happened at birth under normal circumstances. It was while watching this reunion that Cole noticed something small and carved, lying forgotten in the corner where he'd stacked some old belongings. A wooden horse, no bigger than his palm, whittled from a piece of maple during the long evenings of his first winter in the valley. He'd made it for Emma, thinking somehow that if he created something beautiful for her memory, it might ease the ache of loss that lived in his chest like a stone. The mare saw it too, her attention drawn by some quality Cole couldn't identify. She stretched her neck toward the carved toy, nostrils flaring as she investigated this strange object that smelled of wood and old memories. When she touched it with her muzzle, Cole felt something shift in the cabin's atmosphere, as if the past and present had found a way to speak to each other across the years. He picked up the wooden horse, running his thumb over the smooth curves he'd shaped so carefully. Every detail was there, the proud arch of the neck, the flowing mane, the powerful hindquarters bunched with potential energy. He'd carved it in the image of the horses he and Emma had loved to watch in the pastures around their Kansas homestead, the ones that had filled her with wonder and delight. "My daughter would have loved you three," he told the mare softly. "She always said horses were magic, that they could carry you anywhere if you believed hard enough." The mare's ears flicked forward at the sound of his voice, and she moved closer to where he sat beside her foals. For a moment, Cole felt the sharp edge of his grief soften into something more bearable. Not gone, it would never be gone completely, but transformed somehow by the presence of these three lives he'd helped save. The foals were nursing now. The chestnut one stronger and more aggressive about claiming his share, the darker one more tentative but persistent. The mare stood patient and still, her body providing the warmth and nourishment her babies needed to continue their journey back from the edge of death. It was the most natural thing in the world, this dance of survival and care that had been playing out for millions of years. Cole placed the wooden horse on the mantelpiece where the mare could see it, a small sentinel keeping watch over the living family that had found sanctuary in his cabin. The storm still raged outside, but inside there was warmth and life, and the quiet satisfaction that came from having done something right in a world that often seemed determined to punish kindness. As night fell and the wind began to die down, Cole made his preparations for what would likely be several more days of close quarters with his unexpected guests. The mare would need to stay inside until the weather cleared completely. Her condition was still too fragile to risk exposure to the cold. The foals wouldn't be strong enough to travel for at least a week, maybe longer. It meant crowding, inconvenience, the disruption of routines he'd spent 3 years perfecting. It meant sharing his space and his carefully hoarded supplies with creatures who had no way to repay his generosity. It meant opening his heart to the possibility of loss all over again, because animals this fragile could still die despite his best efforts. But as Cole watched the mare settle beside her foals, as he listened to their quiet breathing and felt the peace that came from shelter shared with grateful hearts, he realized that some disruptions were worth embracing. Some risks were worth taking, even for a man who'd sworn off caring too much about anything he might lose. The wooden horse caught the firelight and seemed to nod its carved head in approval, as if Emma herself was watching over this small miracle of rescue and renewal, blessing the choice her father had made to love again despite the cost. 3 days had passed since Cole brought the horses in from the storm, and the cabin had taken on the comfortable chaos of a makeshift nursery. The mare, whom he'd taken to calling Moonlight after the name on the abandoned halter, had claimed the space near the fireplace as her own. The foals, growing stronger by the hour, had begun exploring the cabin with the fearless curiosity of the young. The storm had blown itself out during the second night, leaving behind a world transformed by snow so deep it would take weeks to melt. Cole's Valley looked like something from a child's storybook, all soft curves and pristine drifts that caught the morning light like scattered diamonds. But the beauty came with practical concerns. His supplies were running lower than he'd planned, and Buck needed exercise after days confined to his shelter. Cole was splitting wood outside the cabin when he heard riders approaching from the direction of Millbrook. The sound of hoofbeats in snow was distinctive, muffled but persistent, and he counted at least 2 horses making their way up the trail. Visitors were rare enough in good weather. In the aftermath of a blizzard like the one just passed, they were almost unheard of. He set down his axe and waited, watching the tree line where the trail emerged from the pines. Buck lifted his head from the hay. Cole had scattered for him, ears pricked forward with interest. Inside the cabin, Moonlight nickered softly. She'd grown sensitive to any sound that might signal change or threat to her babies. The first rider to emerge from the trees was Doc Henley, Millbrook's physician, and one of the few men in town Cole considered a friend. The doctor was bundled so heavily against the cold that only his grey beard showed beneath his wool scarf. But Cole recognized the steady way he sat his horse and the deliberate pace that spoke of a man who'd learned to conserve energy over long years of frontier medicine. The second rider was younger, maybe 25, with the eager posture of someone who still believed the world owed him attention. Cole didn't recognize him, but the quality of his coat and the silver trim on his saddle suggested money and the kind of softness that came from lives lived indoors. "Cole," Doc Henley called out as they approached, "heard you might have had some excitement during the storm." "News travels fast for a man who lives alone," Cole replied, not moving from his position beside the woodpile. Doc dismounted with the careful movements of a man feeling his years, but his eyes were sharp as they took in the scene around the cabin. The scattered hay, the extra sets of tracks in the snow, the unmistakable signs that more than one horse had been sheltering here. "This is James Morrison," Doc said, nodding toward his companion. "He's visiting from back east, writing articles about life in the territories. Heard some interesting stories in town about a rescue during the blizzard." Morrison swung down from his horse with the fluid grace of a good rider, but there was something in his manner that put Cole on edge. The way his eyes catalogued everything they saw, as if he was already composing the story he'd tell about this encounter. "Mr. Hart," Morrison said, extending a gloved hand, "I understand you performed quite a heroic deed during the storm, saved some valuable livestock from certain death." Cole shook the offered hand briefly, noting the softness of Morrison's grip. "Did what needed doing. Animals don't deserve to freeze." "Mind if we take a look at these rescued horses?" Morrison asked. "I'm always interested in stories of frontier courage and generosity." There was something in the way he said "valuable livestock" that made Cole's jaw tighten. Not wonder at the rescue itself, but interest in what had been rescued. as if the worth of the act could be measured in dollars rather than lives saved. "They're inside," Cole said carefully. "Mare and 2 foals, still recovering." Doc Henley frowned. "Inside? Cole, that's not like you to bring animals into your living space." "Wasn't much choice. They were nearly dead when I found them, and the foals couldn't survive another night in the cold." They followed him toward the cabin, Morrison's eyes taking in every detail of the rustic building and its surroundings. Cole could practically see the man composing romantic descriptions of frontier life for readers who'd never felt the bite of genuine cold or the weight of real solitude. When Cole opened the cabin door, Moonlight immediately positioned herself between her foals and the strangers, her ears laid back in warning. The foals pressed close to their mother's sides, sensing tension in the adults around them. "Well, I'll be damned," Doc Henley said softly. "Cole, that's Marcus Whitfield's prize-breeding mare. Moonlight, I'd know her anywhere. And those foals," he whistled low under his breath. "One of them's got the bloodlines to be worth a small fortune if he's trained right." Morrison had produced a small notebook and was scribbling rapidly, his eyes bright with the excitement of a man who'd stumbled onto a better story than he'd expected. "Whitfield, that's the rancher who lost everything in the banking collapse, the one who disappeared last month?" "That's the one," Doc confirmed. "Left town owing money to half the merchants and most of his hands. But I thought he'd taken his best stock with him when he ran." Cole felt something cold settle in his stomach that had nothing to do with the weather. "You're saying these horses belong to someone?" "Belonged," Doc corrected. "Whitfield's probably halfway to California by now, assuming he survived whatever desperate scheme drove him to abandon stock this valuable. Question is, what's the legal status of animals abandoned during a storm?" Morrison looked up from his notebook with sharp interest. "That's a fascinating legal question. Salvage rights versus property rights. The frontier equivalent of maritime law, you might say." Cole wanted to throw the man out of his cabin. The way Morrison talked about Moonlight and her foals, as if they were cargo, rather than living beings who'd nearly died in the snow, made his hands clench into fists, but he kept his voice level. "I found them dying," he said simply. "Cut loose and left to freeze. Seemed like the right thing was to bring them somewhere warm." "Oh, absolutely," Morrison said, still writing. "But the economic implications are quite interesting. Prime breeding stock like this could be worth thousands of dollars to the right buyer. And if Whitfield truly abandoned them..." He let the sentence hang, the implication clear. Doc Henley was examining the foals with the professional eye of a man who'd spent decades evaluating livestock. The chestnut's got Arabian lines in his face, and look at the bone structure on the dark one. "Cole, you may have rescued more than you bargained for." "I rescued 3 lives," Cole said firmly. "That's all I was thinking about." But even as he said it, Cole was remembering things that now took on new significance. The quality of Moonlight's conformation, despite her weakened condition. The way both foals carried themselves, even as newborns, there was breeding there, generations of careful selection that showed in every line of their bodies. And there was something else, a memory, nagging at the edge of his consciousness. He'd seen Moonlight before. He was almost certain of it, not recently, but sometime in the past few months, maybe when he'd made one of his rare trips to Millbrook for supplies. "Mr. Hart," Morrison said, "I hope you don't mind if I ask about your own background. For the article, you understand. What brings a man to live alone in country like this?" The question was casual, but Cole heard the calculation behind it. Morrison wasn't just writing about a rescue anymore. He was constructing a human interest story, the kind that played well with Eastern readers who liked their frontier heroes simple and noble. "Man's got a right to privacy," Cole said shortly. Doc Henley sensed the tension building and stepped smoothly between them. "James, maybe we should be getting back to town before the afternoon shadows make the trail dangerous. Cole, you mind if I check these animals over properly? Make sure they're recovering well from their ordeal." Cole nodded, grateful for the distraction. Doc's examination was thorough but gentle, his experienced hands checking the foal's breathing and heart rate, examining their hooves and legs for signs of frostbite damage. Moonlight allowed the inspection, seeming to sense that this human meant no harm to her babies. "They're doing remarkably well," Doc pronounced finally. "You did good work, Cole. Another few hours in that storm and you'd have been finding frozen bodies instead of living animals." Morrison had wandered over to the mantelpiece while Doc worked, and Cole saw him pick up the wooden horse he'd carved for Emma's memory. Something about seeing those soft, uncalloused hands touching that small piece of his past made Cole's vision narrow with anger. "Interesting craftsmanship," Morrison said, turning the carved toy over in his hands. "Did you make this yourself?" "Put it down." Cole's voice was quiet but carried enough edge to make Morrison's eyebrows rise. "Of course, I didn't mean to pry." Morrison set the wooden horse back on the mantelpiece, but not before Cole saw him make another note in his little book. After Doc and Morrison left, promising to return in a few days to check on the horse's progress, Cole found himself pacing the cabin like a caged animal. The visit had shattered the peaceful isolation of the past few days, introducing complications he wasn't prepared to handle. He walked to the small wooden chest, where he kept his most important possessions, the things too precious to leave unguarded, even in his remote sanctuary. Inside, beneath his discharge papers from the army and the deed to his land, was a faded photograph in a silver frame, Margaret and Emma, taken the spring before they died. Margaret was seated in their best chair, Emma standing beside her, with one small hand resting on her mother's shoulder. Both wore their Sunday dresses and the serious expressions people assumed for formal portraits, but Cole could see the warmth in their eyes, the love that had made their little farmhouse feel like the center of the universe. He'd looked at this photograph every day for the first year after their deaths, then forced himself to put it away as the grief threatened to consume him entirely. Now he found himself studying their faces again, searching for guidance in eyes that would never see another sunset. What would Margaret think of his situation? She'd always been the practical one, the voice of reason when his emotions threatened to override his judgment. She'd loved animals as much as he did, but she'd also understood the complexities of ownership and law that came with living in civilized society. "They're not just horses anymore," he told the photograph softly. "They're property, according to folks like Morrison, and I'm just the man who happened to find them." Emma's face smiled back at him from the frame, frozen at 7 years old, forever trusting that her father would make the right choices. She'd loved horses with the pure passion that only children could feel, had begged him countless times for a pony of her own. If she could see Moonlight and the foals now, she'd understand why he couldn't simply turn them over to whoever had the strongest legal claim. But understanding and action were different things. Cole was just one man with limited resources, living on the edge of civilization, where law often came down to who had the most guns or the loudest voice. If someone decided they wanted Moonlight and her foals badly enough, what could he really do to stop them? Outside, the afternoon light was beginning to fade, painting the snow-covered valley in shades of gold and purple. Moonlight had positioned herself near the window where she could watch for threats while keeping her foals close. The chestnut was nursing again, his tail flicking with satisfaction, while the darker foal dozed in the warmth of the fire. They trusted him now, these 3 survivors who'd been thrown away by human carelessness. Moonlight no longer started when he moved around the cabin, and the foals had begun approaching him with the fearless curiosity of babies who'd never learned that the world could be cruel. Cole put the photograph back in its chest and closed the lid gently. Whatever challenges lay ahead, whatever legal complications Morrison's questions might bring, he'd made his choice the moment he'd climbed down from Buck's back in that howling storm. Some decisions couldn't be unmade, and some responsibilities, once accepted, became part of a man's character. The wooden horse watched from the mantelpiece, its carved features serene in the firelight. Emma would have loved these foals, would have named them and made up stories about their adventures. In caring for them, Cole was honoring not just the animals themselves, but the memory of a little girl who'd believed that love was always worth the risk of loss. Tomorrow would bring its own challenges, but tonight there was warmth and peace and the quiet satisfaction of lives preserved against the odds. Sometimes, Cole reflected, that was enough purpose for any man. The silver pocket watch had belonged to Cole's father, carried through 2 wars and 40 years of hard frontier living before coming to rest in Cole's vest pocket. Its steady tick had marked the rhythm of his days in the valley, a constant reminder that time moved forward, whether a man was ready or not. Now, as Cole checked it for the dozenth time in the past hour, it read just past noon, meaning Sheriff Daly and his companions were already an hour late for their promised visit. Word had spread through Millbrook faster than a grass fire in drought season. Morrison's article in the territorial newspaper had painted Cole as a frontier hero, complete with romantic descriptions of his lonely vigil and selfless rescue. But the reporter had also made sure to mention the potential value of the horses, speculating about ownership rights and legal precedents in language that attracted exactly the kind of attention Cole had hoped to avoid. The consequences had been swift and predictable. 3 days after the article appeared, a delegation from town had ridden out to discuss the situation. Sheriff Tom Daly led the group, his star catching the winter sunlight as he dismounted near Cole's cabin. Behind him came Judge Cornelius Blackwood, whose black coat and severe expression made him look like an undertaker, and a third man. Cole didn't recognize someone with the soft look of indoor work and the expensive clothes that marked him as either a lawyer or a politician. "Mr. Hart," Sheriff Daly called out, his tone carrying the artificial friendliness that lawmen used when they wanted to avoid immediate trouble. "Appreciate you taking the time to see us." Cole stood in his doorway, not moving aside to invite them in. Inside the cabin, Moonlight had positioned herself protectively over her foals, sensing the tension in the humans around her. The chestnut foal, now strong enough to stand for long periods, pressed against his mother's side, with eyes wide and alert. "Sheriff," Cole acknowledged. "Judge, you've ridden a long way for a conversation." Judge Blackwood stepped forward, his breath steaming in the cold air. "Mr. Hart, we're here about the horses you're harboring. There are legal questions that need to be addressed, ownership issues that can't be resolved through frontier charity." "Harboring?" Cole's voice remained level, but his hand drifted instinctively toward the watch in his vest pocket. "That's an interesting choice of words for saving lives." The third man cleared his throat and introduced himself. "Theodore Marsh, territorial attorney. I've been asked to look into this matter by several interested parties." He produced a leather portfolio from his coat and withdrew several official-looking documents. "We have statements from multiple witnesses confirming that the mare in your possession matches the description of valuable breeding stock owned by Marcus Whitfield." "Whitfield's gone," Cole said. "Ran out on his debts and disappeared. How can a man who's abandoned his responsibilities claim ownership of anything?" "That's precisely the legal question we're here to resolve," Marsh replied smoothly. "Under territorial law, livestock abandonment doesn't automatically transfer ownership. If Mr. Whitfield can be located, or if his debts are assumed by another party, legal ownership might be contested." Sheriff Daly stepped closer, his hand resting casually on his gun belt. "Cole, nobody's questioning what you did. You saved those horses, and that's commendable. But there are proper channels for situations like this, legal procedures that need to be followed." "Legal procedures." Cole pulled out his father's pocket watch and checked the time, a gesture that bought him a moment to think. The watch face caught the sunlight, its silver surface reflecting the serious faces of the men arrayed before him. Would those be the same legal procedures that let Whitfield run up debts all over town and then disappear without consequence? Judge Blackwood's expression darkened. "Mr. Hart, I understand your frustration, but the law exists to protect everyone's rights, not just those we personally approve of. If every man took it upon himself to decide questions of ownership based on his own moral judgments, we'd have chaos." And if every man walked past dying animals because the paperwork wasn't in order, we'd have something worse than chaos, Cole replied. We'd have a country without conscience. Attorney Marsh cleared his throat again, consulting his papers. Mr. Hart, according to our research, you have no legal claim to these animals. You're not a licensed livestock dealer, you have no bill of sale, and you've made no attempt to register the rescue through proper channels. Frankly, your continued possession of valuable property could be construed as theft. The word theft hung in the cold air like a slap. Cole felt his father's watch tick steadily against his chest, marking seconds that seemed to stretch into hours. Around them, the pristine snow of his valley reflected the winter sun with painful brightness, making the dark figures of the law seem like shadows cast across his carefully ordered life. That's a serious accusation, Cole said quietly. It's a serious situation, Judge Blackwood replied. Mr. Hart, we're not here to arrest you or create difficulties. We're here to resolve this matter in a way that respects both your humanitarian impulses and the legal requirements of territorial law. Sheriff Daly nodded agreement. Cole, you know me. We've never had problems between us. But there are people in town asking questions, making noise about valuable horses and legal precedents. I can't ignore that kind of pressure indefinitely. Cole studied the three men, noting the way they stood together despite their different roles. Law, politics, and enforcement, presenting a united front. Behind their reasonable words and civilized manner, he could feel the weight of a system that valued property rights over individual conscience, legal precedent over moral action. What exactly are you proposing? He asked. Attorney Marsh consulted his papers again. The territorial government is prepared to purchase the horses from you at a fair market price, compensating you for your rescue efforts and the care you've provided. The animals would then be held in trust while ownership questions are resolved through proper legal channels. Held where? There's a livestock facility in Cheyenne that handles such matters. Professional care, proper documentation, all very transparent and legal. Cole's hand tightened around his pocket watch. The thought of Moonlight and her foals being loaded into a cattle car and shipped to some government facility, separated from the man who'd saved their lives and placed among strangers who saw them only as valuable property, made his stomach clench with anger. And if I refuse your generous offer? The three men exchanged glances before Judge Blackwood answered, Mr. Hart, we hope it doesn't come to that. But if you continue to harbor stolen property after being officially notified of its status, we'd have no choice but to pursue legal remedies, including seizure of the animals and potential criminal charges, Attorney Marsh added helpfully. Sheriff Daly looked uncomfortable with his companion's bluntness. Cole, it doesn't have to go that way. You're a reasonable man. We can work something out that respects everyone's interests. Everyone's interests, Cole repeated. He pulled out his pocket watch again, noting how the silver had warmed from contact with his body. His father had carried this watch through the Mexican War and the early days of territorial expansion, through times when law was what honest men made it, and justice was measured by a man's actions rather than his paperwork. Sheriff, Cole said finally, you've known me for 3 years. Have I ever given you cause to doubt my character? No, you haven't. That's why I'm hoping we can resolve this peacefully. Judge Blackwood, in your legal opinion, does saving a life create any moral obligation? The judge frowned. The law doesn't recognize moral obligations that conflict with property rights, Mr. Hart. That's a dangerous precedent. And Mr. Marsh, Cole continued, in your experience, how often do legal technicalities serve justice versus how often they serve the interests of those with the best lawyers? Attorney Marsh's expression remained neutral. The law is the law, Mr. Hart. Personal interpretations of justice are irrelevant to legal proceedings. Cole nodded slowly, as if their answers had confirmed something he'd already suspected. Gentlemen, I appreciate you riding out here to explain the situation. You've made your positions very clear. And your position, Mr. Hart? Judge Blackwood asked. Cole looked back toward his cabin, where Moonlight's dark silhouette was visible through the window. The mare was watching the confrontation with intelligent eyes, her maternal instincts alert to any threat to her foals. She trusted him now, had placed her life and her baby's lives in his hands, based on nothing more than his actions, during a desperate night in a howling blizzard. "My position," Cole said, returning his father's watch to his vest pocket, "is that some things matter more than legal technicalities. Those horses were dying when I found them. They're alive and healthy now because I chose to act rather than worry about paperwork. That choice created an obligation that I don't intend to abandon just because it's legally inconvenient." Attorney Marsh shook his head. "Mr. Hart, you're making this much more difficult than it needs to be. The territorial government is offering you a fair resolution." "The territorial government is asking me to betray a trust," Cole replied. "That's not the same thing." Sheriff Daly stepped forward, his expression genuinely concerned. "Cole, think about what you're doing. This could end badly for you. These men have legal authority, and they're not going to simply give up and ride away." "I'm thinking about exactly what I'm doing, Tom, and what I'm not doing is turning those horses over to people who see them as property instead of lives I was privileged to save." The three men conferred quietly among themselves, their voices too low for Cole to hear the specific words, but their body language speaking clearly of frustration and determination. When they turned back to him, Judge Blackwood's expression had hardened into official displeasure. "Mr. Hart, you have 72 hours to reconsider your position. After that, we'll be forced to take official action to recover the stolen property." 3 days, Cole repeated. "Just enough time for you to get back to town and file your papers." "Just enough time for you to come to your senses," Attorney Marsh corrected. They mounted their horses with the efficient movements of men, accustomed to making official visits to reluctant citizens. As they prepared to leave, Sheriff Daly lingered for a moment, his expression troubled. "Cole, I meant what I said. This could end badly. There are powerful people taking an interest in this situation, people with influence and resources you don't want to cross." "There always are," Cole replied. "But sometimes a man has to decide whether he's going to live by his principles or by other people's convenience." After they rode away, Cole stood in the growing afternoon shadows, his father's pocket watch ticking steadily against his chest. 3 days. 72 hours to either surrender the horses he'd rescued or face the full weight of territorial law and the interests that drove it. Inside the cabin, moonlight nickered softly, calling to him with the voice that had learned to associate his presence with safety and care. The foals were probably hungry again, ready for the careful feeding schedule that had brought them back from the edge of death. Cole pulled out his watch one more time, noting how the silver caught the last rays of sunlight slanting across his valley. His father had faced his own moments of choice, times when legal authority and personal conscience pulled in different directions. The old man had never talked much about those decisions, but he'd worn this watch through all of them, keeping faith with the belief that time itself was neutral. It was what a man did with his allotted moments that defined his character. 3 days to decide between law and justice, between safety and principle, between the easy path of compliance and the hard road of standing alone against forces larger than himself. Cole smiled grimly and returned the watch to his pocket. Some decisions, he reflected, had been made the moment he'd climbed down from Buck's back in that howling storm. Everything since then was just the world catching up to what his heart had already known. The iron brand lay on Cole's kitchen table like a piece of evidence in a trial that hadn't started yet. Sheriff Daly had left it behind after his second visit, claiming it was necessary for proper identification of the horses. But Cole could read the subtext in the lawman's troubled eyes. This was proof of ownership that couldn't be argued away with sentiment or moral philosophy. The brand was well made, forged by a smith who understood his craft. The letter was enclosed in a circle, with a flourish beneath that suggested prosperity and pride. Marcus Whitfield's mark burned into the hide of every animal that had ever belonged to his ranch. Cole had found the corresponding mark on Moonlight's left shoulder, a healed scar that told the legal story as clearly as any deed or bill of sale. Outside, the February wind carried the promise of more snow, but inside the cabin, warmth and life continued their quiet dance of recovery. The foals had grown stronger every day, their legs steadier, their curiosity bolder. The chestnut had begun to venture away from his mother's side, exploring the cabin with the fearless confidence of youth. The darker foal was more cautious but equally alert, watching everything with intelligent dark eyes that reminded Cole of his father's careful way of studying new situations. Moonlight herself had regained much of her condition, her coat beginning to show the lustrous health that proper feed and care could restore. But Cole noticed that she still positioned herself between her foals and the door whenever strangers approached, still startled at sudden sounds that might signal threat. Trust, once broken, was not easily repaired, even in animals who had every reason to be grateful for their rescue. The deadline Sheriff Daly had given him was now less than 24 hours away. Tomorrow at noon, if Cole hadn't surrendered the horses voluntarily, legal action would begin. Warrants would be issued, federal marshals might be called in, and the quiet life he'd built in this remote valley would be shattered like ice in a spring thaw. Doc Henley had ridden out that morning, ostensibly to check on the horse's health, but really to make one last attempt at convincing Cole to accept the territorial government's offer. The old physician had examined each animal carefully, pronouncing them fully recovered and fit for travel, then settled into Cole's chair by the fire with the air of a man who had difficult truths to share. "They're beautiful animals," Doc had said, watching the foals play with the gentle roughhousing that marked healthy young horses. "That chestnut's got the bone structure to be a fine saddle horse, and the dark one. There's speed in those lines, Cole. Racing blood, if I'm any judge. Makes them more valuable, does it? Makes them more dangerous for you to keep," Doc had replied bluntly. "Cole, I've been asking questions around town, talking to people who knew Marcus Whitfield before he went bust. Those horses aren't just valuable, they're famous. Moonlight's bloodlines trace back to some of the finest Arabian stock in the country, and those foals. Their sire was a stallion worth more than most men see in a lifetime." Cole had felt something cold settle in his stomach. Famous how? Horse racing circles, breeding associations. There are people in Denver and San Francisco who know these animals by reputation, who've been watching Whitfield's program for years. Doc's expression had grown troubled. Morrison's article didn't just reach territorial readers, Cole. It got picked up by papers back east, horse magazines, breeding journals. You've got national attention now, whether you wanted it or not. That conversation had been 6 hours ago, and Cole was still wrestling with its implications. He'd thought he was dealing with local politics and territorial law, but Doc's news suggested forces much larger and more powerful than anything a lone man in a remote valley could hope to resist. The iron brand caught the firelight and seemed to pulse with malevolent life. Such a simple thing, a piece of shaped metal designed to mark ownership in a way that couldn't be disputed or removed. But it represented something more complex and troubling. The legal framework that turned living creatures into property, that valued blood and breeding over the simple fact of rescue and care. Cole picked up the brand and turned it over in his hands, noting the weight of the iron and the precision of the craftsmanship. Somewhere in the past, this mark had been heated until it glowed red-hot, then pressed against Moonlight's hide while she was held immobile by ropes and strong hands. The pain would have been intense but brief, leaving a permanent scar that declared her status as owned, claimed, possessed by human authority. Did it matter that the man who'd wielded this brand had abandoned her to die in a blizzard? Did it matter that Cole had risked his own life to save hers? According to the law, according to men like Judge Blackwood and Attorney Marsh, the brand was all that mattered. Everything else, compassion, sacrifice, the bonds formed through shared hardship, was legally irrelevant. A soft nickering from moonlight drew his attention back to the present. The mare was watching him with those intelligent eyes, and Cole wondered if she remembered the branding, if she understood what that mark on her shoulder meant in human terms. Animals didn't think in terms of ownership and property rights, but they understood care and kindness, protection and abandonment. The foals had noticed his mood and approached with the tentative curiosity they showed when the adults around them seemed troubled. The chestnut nuzzled his hand, while the darker one investigated his boots with gentle lips. Their trust was complete and uncomplicated, based on nothing more than his consistent care and protection. Cole set the brand back on the table and reached for his father's journal, seeking guidance in the words of a man who'd faced his own moral crises. The leather binding fell open to an entry from the early days of his parents' marriage, when they'd been struggling to establish their homestead in Kansas. May 17, 1855, found a family of settlers camped by the creek, half-starved and beaten down by the trail. The woman was sick with fever, and the children looked like scarecrows. Tom says, "We can't feed every hard-luck story that comes along, that we barely have enough for ourselves." But Margaret took one look at those babies and started heating soup. Says a man's character isn't measured by what he keeps, but by what he shares when sharing hurts. Cole smiled despite his troubled mood. His mother had been like that, unable to turn away from suffering, regardless of the cost or inconvenience. She'd passed that quality to Emma, who'd brought home every injured bird and orphaned kitten she'd ever found, confident that her father would know how to heal whatever was broken. But his mother had also been practical, aware that good intentions needed to be backed by careful planning and realistic assessment of consequences. She wouldn't have advised him to sacrifice everything for a noble gesture, but she also wouldn't have counseled surrender in the face of legal bullying. Another entry, dated just months before her death, caught his eye. September 3rd, 1,872 Coles, been offered a job with the territorial government, good steady pay, and a chance to use his skills with horses. But it would mean moving to Cheyenne, leaving this place we've built together. I told him the choice was his to make, but I hope he remembers that some things can't be measured in dollars and security. A man needs to know he's living by his own principles, not just following the path of least resistance. She'd been right, as always. Cole had turned down that job offer, choosing to stay on their homestead and continue the life they'd built together. It had been the right decision then, even though it had cost him opportunities and advancement. Now he faced a similar choice between security and principle, between the easy path and the one that honored the values his parents had tried to instill in him. A knock at the door interrupted his thoughts. Cole's hand moved instinctively to his gun belt before he recognized the familiar pattern. 3 quick raps, then 2. Doc Henley's signal from their army days, when they'd served together in the territorial militia. But when Cole opened the door, Doc wasn't alone. Behind him stood a young woman Cole had never seen before, bundled in a fur-lined coat that spoke of money and Eastern refinement. She was perhaps 25, with dark hair and the kind of direct gaze that suggested intelligence and determination. "Cole," Doc said, "I'd like you to meet Sarah Mitchell. She's traveled a long way to see you." The woman stepped forward, extending a gloved hand. "Mr. Hart, I've read about your rescue of the horses. I believe one of them may have belonged to my grandfather." Cole felt the world shift beneath his feet, like snow, giving way on a steep slope. "Your grandfather? Thomas Mitchell. He owned a ranch in Colorado before he died last year. My grandfather bred Arabian horses, and according to his records, he sold a mare named Moonlight to Marcus Whitfield about 2 years ago." Sarah's eyes were bright with excitement and something that might have been hope. "Mr. Hart, I think you may have rescued my inheritance." Cole stared at her, his mind racing through the implications. If Sarah Mitchell could prove ownership of Moonlight, if she had legal documents that predated Whitfield's claim, then everything changed. The territorial government's case would collapse, Whitfield's brand would become meaningless, and the horses he'd rescued might actually belong to someone who valued them for more than their breeding potential. But it also meant complications he hadn't anticipated, questions about his own role in a situation that was growing more complex by the hour. Sarah Mitchell might have a legal claim to the horses, but did that make her any different from the other people who saw them as valuable property rather than lives he'd been privileged to save? The iron brand lay on his table like a challenge, its W marking claiming ownership that might no longer be valid. But brands could be challenged, ownership could be transferred, and sometimes the law served justice instead of just protecting the powerful. Cole looked at Sarah Mitchell's eager face, then at Moonlight and her foals standing alert by the fireplace, and realized that his 72 hours of grace had just become infinitely more complicated. Tomorrow's deadline still loomed, but now there was a new player in the game, one who might hold the key to everything or might simply represent another kind of claim on lives he'd sworn to protect. The iron brand caught the firelight and seemed to whisper of secrets yet to be revealed, of legal battles that would determine not just ownership, but the very nature of justice, in a territory where law was still being written by the actions of individuals brave enough to stand up for what they believed was right. Sarah Mitchell's leather satchel contained documents that would have made Attorney Marsh's eyes light up with professional appreciation. Bills of sale, breeding certificates, correspondence between her grandfather and Marcus Whitfield dating back 3 years, all meticulously organized and bearing the kind of official seals that territorial courts respected. But it was the final document, yellow with age and bearing her grandfather's careful signature, that made Cole's breath catch in his throat. "This is the original deed of sale," Sarah explained, spreading the paper on Cole's kitchen table beside the iron brand. "Grandfather sold Moonlight to Whitfield in October of 1891, but there were conditions. Look at the clause near the bottom." Cole leaned closer, squinting at the faded ink. The legal language was dense and formal, but the meaning became clear as he read. "Should the purchaser fail to maintain said animal in good health and proper condition, or should said animal be abandoned or subjected to neglect, ownership shall revert to the original owner or his designated heirs." "Your grandfather protected her," Cole said softly. "He protected all his horses that way," Sarah replied. "Grandfather loved his animals more than he loved money. He'd heard stories about buyers who worked valuable horses to death or abandoned them when they became inconvenient. This clause was his insurance policy." Doc Henley whistled low under his breath. "Sarah, if this document is legitimate, and it certainly looks it, then Whitfield lost legal ownership the moment he abandoned those horses in the storm." Cole felt something like hope stirring in his chest, but years of hard experience had taught him to be cautious about easy solutions. "What about the foals? They were born after your grandfather died." Sarah's smile was sad but determined. "According to territorial law, offspring follow the dam's ownership status. If Moonlight reverted to grandfather's estate when Whitfield abandoned her, then her foals belonged to me as his sole heir." The implications were staggering. If Sarah was right, if her documents were accepted by territorial courts, then Cole had been harboring stolen property at all. He'd been caring for horses that belonged to a woman who'd traveled halfway across the country to reclaim her inheritance. The territorial government's case would collapse. Sheriff Daly's warrants would become meaningless, and the deadline that had been hanging over Cole's head like an executioner's blade would lose all its power. But Cole had learned to be suspicious of solutions that seemed too convenient, and something about Sarah's story nagged at the edges of his consciousness like a splinter he couldn't quite locate. "Miss Mitchell," he said carefully, "how did you know to come here?" "Doc tells me Morrison's article was picked up by Eastern papers, but even so, connecting those horses to your grandfather's stock would have taken considerable research." Sarah's expression flickered for just a moment, so briefly that Cole might have imagined it. I've been tracking grandfather's horses for months, trying to locate the animals Whitfield bought before he disappeared. When I read Morrison's description of the mare you rescued, particularly the mention of her Arabian bloodlines and distinctive markings, I suspected it might be Moonlight. It was a reasonable explanation, but Cole's instincts, honed by years of reading animal behavior and human nature, suggested there was more to the story. Sarah Mitchell was intelligent and well-educated, clearly from a wealthy family, but there was something in her manner that spoke of desperation, carefully concealed beneath Eastern polish. "That's quite a coincidence," Cole said, "finding exactly the horse you were looking for in exactly the right place at exactly the right time." Sarah's chin lifted slightly, and Cole saw steel beneath the refined exterior. "Mr. Hart, I understand your suspicion. In your position, I'd be asking the same questions. But the truth is, I've been searching for these horses for 8 months, ever since I discovered that grandfather's estate was worth far less than anyone expected." She paused, seeming to wrestle with how much to reveal. "My family's finances aren't what they appear to be. Grandfather's ranch failed 2 years before he died, and most of his assets were sold to pay debts. The horses he'd sold to Whitfield represented the last valuable portion of his estate, my inheritance and my only hope of financial independence." Doc Henley leaned back in his chair, studying Sarah with the same careful attention he gave to patients whose symptoms didn't quite match their obvious ailments. "Sarah, that still doesn't explain how you knew to come here specifically." "Because I hired a detective," Sarah said simply. "A Pinkerton agent named Daniel Walsh, who specializes in tracking stolen livestock. When Whitfield disappeared, Walsh followed his trail west, documenting which animals Whitfield had taken and which he'd left behind. When Morrison's article appeared, Walsh recognized the description immediately. She reached into her satchel and produced another document, a typed report bearing the distinctive Pinkerton agency letterhead. Walsh's investigation revealed that Whitfield abandoned at least a dozen valuable animals during his flight west. Moonlight and her foals were simply the ones lucky enough to be found by someone willing to save them. Cole read through the detective's report, noting the professional thoroughness of the investigation and the meticulous documentation of Whitfield's movements in the weeks before his disappearance. According to Walsh's findings, Whitfield had been desperate enough to abandon stock worth thousands of dollars rather than take the time to transport animals that might slow his escape. "This changes everything," Doc said quietly. "If Sarah can prove ownership through her grandfather's estate, and if Walsh's investigation confirms that Whitfield abandoned the horses illegally, then the territorial government has no case," Cole finished, "and Sheriff Daly's deadline becomes irrelevant." But even as he said it, Cole felt a nagging doubt. Something about the timing still bothered him, the way Sarah had appeared just hours before his deadline, the convenient completeness of her documentation, the almost theatrical way she'd revealed each piece of evidence. It was possible she was exactly what she appeared to be, a young woman fighting to reclaim her rightful inheritance. But it was also possible she was something else entirely. Moonlight nickered softly from her position by the fireplace, and Cole saw the mare's ears flick towards Sarah with interest. Animals were often better judges of character than humans, and Moonlight's response suggested genuine recognition rather than the wariness she'd shown toward other strangers. "Miss Mitchell," Cole said, "would you mind if I asked you to approach Moonlight?" Slowly, so as not to startle her. Sarah looked puzzled but nodded. She moved toward the mare with the confident grace of someone comfortable around horses, extending her hand palm up in the universal gesture of peaceful intent. Moonlight stretched her neck forward, nostrils flaring as she investigated Sarah's scent. What happened next settled one of Cole's doubts definitively. Moonlight not only allowed Sarah to touch her muzzle, but actively pressed against the woman's hand, whickering with the soft sound of recognition and pleasure. The mare remembered her, knew her scent and voice from the time before Whitfield's ownership. "She knows you," Cole said, "and it wasn't a question. I spent a summer at grandfather's ranch when I was 16, Sarah admitted. Moonlight was just a yearling then, but I helped with her training. Grandfather always said she was special, that she'd produce foals that would make his reputation in breeding circles. The foals had noticed the reunion between their mother and this new human, and they approached with the bold curiosity that marked their growing confidence. Sarah knelt down to their level, allowing them to investigate her hands and clothing while she spoke to them in the low, soothing voice that experienced horsemen used with young animals. "The chestnut is just like his grandmother," she said softly. "Same bone structure, same intelligent eyes. And the dark one has his great-grandfather's, marking, see that white star on his forehead. It's been in the bloodline for 3 generations. Cole felt his suspicions dissolving in the face of Sarah's obvious knowledge and genuine affection for the horses. She wasn't some opportunistic stranger trying to claim valuable property. She was family, in the way that mattered to animals who remembered kindness and recognized the sense of those who'd cared for them. But her arrival also created new complications. If Sarah's claim was legitimate, if territorial courts accepted her grandfather's deed and Walsh's investigation, then the horses Cole had rescued would belong to her. She'd have the legal right to take them wherever she chose, to sell them or breed them, or make whatever decisions seemed best for her financial situation. The thought of Moonlight and her foals leaving his valley, of never seeing them again after nursing them back from the edge of death, created an ache in Cole's chest that he hadn't expected. Somewhere in the past weeks, without conscious decision, he'd begun thinking of them as his, not in the legal sense that the iron brand represented, but in the deeper way that came from shared hardship and mutual trust. "Mr. Hart," Sarah said, looking up from where she knelt beside the foals, "I want you to know that I understand what you've done for them." Walsh's report included details about the storm and the condition they were in when you found them. "Without your intervention, they would have died. I did what anyone would have done." "No," Sarah said firmly. "You did what you did, and that's not the same thing at all. Most people would have ridden past or convinced themselves that the storm made rescue impossible. You risked your own life to save theirs, and then you've spent weeks caring for them when you could have turned them over to authorities and walked away." She stood, brushing straw from her skirt, and Cole saw determination in her posture that reminded him of his own mother's quiet strength. "Mr. Hart, I have a proposition for you, something that might serve everyone's interests better than a legal battle over ownership." Doc Henley leaned forward with interest. "What kind of proposition?" "A partnership," Sarah said simply. "I have legal claim to the horses, but Mr. Hart has the knowledge and skill to care for them properly. I have the resources to establish a breeding program, but I need someone who understands their individual needs and temperaments." Cole felt his heart skip a beat. "You're saying you want to leave them here?" "I'm saying I want to build something here," Sarah replied. "With your help, if you're willing. A horse ranch that honors grandfather's vision while providing security for all of us. You'd have full authority over their daily care, and I'd handle the business and legal aspects. Partners, not owner and employee." The hidden deed lay on the table between them, its faded ink holding the key to questions that had seemed impossibly complex just hours ago. Cole looked at the document, then at Sarah's earnest face, then at Moonlight and her foals standing peacefully in the warmth of his cabin. It wasn't the solution he'd expected, but it addressed the central problem that had been keeping him awake at night. The horses would be safe, legally protected by Sarah's legitimate claim and physically protected by his continued care. The territorial government's case would collapse. Sheriff Daly's deadline would become meaningless. And the life Cole had built in his remote valley could continue enhanced rather than destroyed by the presence of the animals he'd rescued. But partnerships required trust, and Cole had learned to be cautious about trusting people whose interests might diverge from his own when circumstances changed. Sarah Mitchell seemed sincere, but she was also from a world of wealth and social connections that operated by rules Cole didn't fully understand. "Miss Mitchell," he said carefully, "that's a generous offer, but I need to understand something. What happens if you decide to sell them? if financial pressures force you to liquidate assets. Sarah's expression grew serious. Mr. Hart, if I wanted to sell them, I could do that right now with the documentation I have. I could claim them, transport them to Denver or San Francisco, and auction them to the highest bidder. The fact that I'm offering partnership instead should tell you something about my intentions. She was right, and Cole felt some of his caution easing. A woman interested only in profit wouldn't have traveled across 2 territories to offer partnership to a stranger. She'd have simply claimed her property and left with it. There's something else, Sarah continued. Walsh's investigation uncovered evidence that Whitfield wasn't just a failed rancher. He was involved in a systematic scheme to defraud horse breeders across 3 territories. The animals he bought were often resold quickly before the original owners could discover the fraud. Moonlight and her foals were probably meant to be sold within weeks of their birth. Doc Henley whistled again. Sarah, if that's true, then there may be other people with legitimate claims to horses Whitfield sold illegally. Exactly, which means the territorial government's interest in this case goes far beyond 3 horses in a remote cabin. They want to use your situation as a test case, Mr. Hart, to establish precedents for how abandoned livestock claims will be handled across the territories. Cole felt the weight of larger forces pressing in around his simple act of rescue. What had begun as a straightforward choice between saving lives and minding his own business had evolved into something that might affect territorial law and federal precedent. The iron brand on his table suddenly seemed less like evidence of ownership and more like a symbol of the complex legal web that surrounded every act of conscience in an organized society. The hidden deed offered a way out of that web, a path that honored both legal requirements and moral obligations. But it also represented a fundamental change in the life Cole had built for himself, from solitude to partnership, from independence to shared responsibility. He looked at Moonlight, standing calm and alert with her foals pressed against her sides, and remembered the moment in the storm when he'd first seen them fighting for life against impossible odds. The choice he'd made then had led inevitably to this moment, to this opportunity to build something larger and more meaningful than mere survival. Miss Mitchell, Cole said finally, I think we need to talk more about this partnership of yours. But first, we need to get these documents to Sheriff Daly before his deadline expires. Whatever we decide to build together, it won't matter if the territorial government seizes the horses first. Sarah smiled, and Cole saw relief and hope in her expression. Mr. Hart, I think that's the beginning of a very good partnership indeed. The hidden deed lay between them like a bridge across troubled waters, its faded ink holding the promise of justice served and lives protected through the simple power of preparation, meeting opportunity at exactly the right moment. The telegraph key at Miller's General Store in Millbrook had been chattering almost continuously since dawn, carrying messages between territorial capitals and federal offices with an urgency that made the store owner nervous. James Miller had operated the telegraph for 15 years, and he'd learned to read the rhythm of official communications. When government offices started sending coded messages at 6 in the morning, it usually meant someone was about to have a very bad day. Cole and Sarah rode into town just as the sun reached its zenith, their horses' breath steaming in the cold air and their faces set with the determination of people who'd made difficult decisions. Behind them, Doc Henley led a pack horse, carrying Sarah's documentation and additional evidence that Daniel Walsh had forwarded from Denver. The Pinkerton detectives' investigation had uncovered a web of fraud that reached far beyond Marcus Whitfield's immediate crimes. Sheriff Tom Daly was waiting for them outside his office, his expression grim and his hand resting on his gun belt with more than casual alertness. Beside him stood Attorney Marsh and Judge Blackwood, both looking like men who'd received unwelcome news and were preparing to deliver worse. Cole, the sheriff called out as they approached, you're cutting it mighty close to that deadline. Tom, Cole replied, dismounting and helping Sarah down from her horse. I'd like you to meet Sarah Mitchell. She's got some information that might interest you about those horses you're so concerned with." Judge Blackwood stepped forward, his black coat flapping in the wind like a raven's wings. "Mr. Hart, I hope you're not planning to waste our time with more frontier sentiment. We've received instructions from the territorial capital that make your situation quite clear." "What kind of instructions?" Sarah asked, her voice carrying the crisp authority of someone accustomed to dealing with officials. Attorney Marsh consulted a telegram in his hand. "Miss, I don't believe we've been introduced." "Theodore Marsh, territorial attorney. And you are?" "Sarah Mitchell, granddaughter of Thomas Mitchell of Colorado, and rightful owner of the horses, Mr. Hart rescued." Sarah's words fell into the cold air like stones into still water, creating ripples of surprise that Cole could see in the officials' faces. "That's a serious claim," Judge Blackwood said carefully. "Do you have documentation to support it?" Sarah gestured toward the packhorse, where Doc was unloading her satchel. "Complete documentation, including the original deed of sale, with specific clauses regarding abandonment and reversion of ownership. Also, a comprehensive investigation by Pinkerton detective Daniel Walsh confirming that Marcus Whitfield abandoned the horses illegally." Cole watched the three officials exchange glances, their confidence beginning to crack in the face of evidence they hadn't expected. But there was something in their manner that suggested this wasn't just about three horses anymore, something larger and more complex than a simple question of ownership. "Mr. Hart," Attorney Marsh said, "before we examine Miss Mitchell's documentation, there's something you need to know. We've received word from federal authorities that Marcus Whitfield has been located." Cole felt the world shift beneath his feet. "Located where?" "San Francisco. He was arrested 3 days ago on charges of interstate horse theft and fraud. It seems your rescue has attracted attention from law enforcement agencies across multiple territories." Sheriff Daly looked uncomfortable, but pressed on. "Cole, Whitfield's claiming that his horses were stolen from him, not abandoned. He's demanding federal intervention to recover his property and prosecute whoever's been harboring them." Sarah laughed, but there was no humor in the sound. "Gentlemen, Marcus Whitfield lost any claim to those horses the moment he cut Moonlight's halter and left her to die in a blizzard. My grandfather's deed makes that perfectly clear." "Your grandfather's deed," Judge Blackwood said slowly, "assuming it's authentic and legally binding, which would need to be determined by proper authorities." Doc Henley had finished unloading the documentation and now approached carrying Sarah's leather satchel. "Judge, I've examined these documents personally. They bear all the appropriate seals and signatures, and the paper and ink are consistent with their claimed dates." "Dr. Henley, you're a physician, not a documents examiner," Attorney Marsh replied smoothly. "Legal authentication requires more specialized expertise." Cole was beginning to understand the shape of the trap that was closing around them. Federal authorities wanted to make an example of someone, and his rescue of the horses had provided a convenient test case. Sarah's legitimate claim threatened to upset whatever legal precedent they were trying to establish. "What exactly are you saying?" Cole asked. Judge Blackwood pulled out his own telegram and read from it carefully. "Federal marshals are en route to take custody of the horses, pending resolution of interstate fraud charges against Marcus Whitfield. The animals will be held as evidence until his trial concludes." "And how long might that take?" Sarah's voice was deceptively calm, but Cole could see tension in her posture. "Federal courts move slowly," Attorney Marsh admitted. "Could be months, maybe longer if there are appeals." The telegraph key inside Miller's store began chattering again, its urgent rhythm cutting through the conversation like a blade. James Miller appeared in his doorway, holding a fresh message and looking troubled. "Sheriff," Miller called out, "got another wire for you," marked urgent from the territorial capital. Daly took the message and read it quickly, his frown deepening with each line. When he finished, he looked up at Cole, with something that might have been sympathy. "Federal marshals will be here tomorrow morning. They've got orders to seize the horses and transport them to Denver for federal custody. Cole felt anger building in his chest, hot and clean and focused. So Whitfield abandons them to die. I saved their lives, and now the federal government wants to use them as evidence in a trial that might drag on for years? That's about the size of it, Sheriff Daly confirmed. I'm sorry, Cole. I tried to argue for local resolution, but this has gone beyond territorial jurisdiction. Sarah stepped forward, her refined exterior giving way to something harder and more determined. Gentlemen, I believe you're underestimating the strength of my legal position. My grandfather's deed isn't just a bill of sale, it's a contract with specific performance clauses that Marcus Whitfield violated when he abandoned Moonlight. She opened her satchel and withdrew a thick folder that Cole hadn't seen before. Daniel Walsh's investigation uncovered additional evidence that Marcus Whitfield was never the legal owner of those horses to begin with. He purchased them with fraudulent bank drafts that were never honored. Judge Blackwood's expression sharpened. That's a serious accusation, Miss Mitchell. It's a documented fact, Sarah replied, handing him the folder. Bank records from Denver, testimony from the bank president, copies of the fraudulent drafts. Marcus Whitfield stole those horses from my grandfather, and any subsequent claim he makes is based on illegal possession. Cole watched the judge's face as he read through the documentation, saw the moment when professional interest replaced bureaucratic resistance. Whatever Sarah had discovered, it was more substantial than anyone had expected. This changes the legal landscape considerably, Judge Blackwood admitted. If Whitfield's original purchase was fraudulent, then he never had legitimate ownership to transfer or abandon. Attorney Marsh leaned over to read the documents, his expression growing increasingly troubled. These bank records, if they're authentic, they suggest a pattern of fraud that goes far beyond simple horse theft. The telegraph key started up again, its insistent rhythm drawing everyone's attention toward Miller's store. The store owner emerged with another message, this one addressed to Sarah rather than the officials. Miss Mitchell, wire for you from Denver. Marked urgent. Sarah took the telegram and read it quickly, her face brightening with something that might have been relief. Gentlemen, it appears that Daniel Walsh has been busy. Marcus Whitfield has confessed to multiple counts of fraud in exchange for reduced federal charges. According to this message, he's specifically renounced any claim to horses he purchased with fraudulent instruments. She handed the telegram to Judge Blackwood, whose expression was becoming increasingly uncomfortable. Walsh says Whitfield is cooperating fully with federal investigators and has provided a complete list of animals he acquired illegally. Moonlight and her foals are specifically mentioned as property he never had legitimate right to possess. Cole felt hope stirring in his chest, but years of hard experience had taught him not to trust easy victories. What does that mean for the federal seizure order? It means, Sarah said with a smile that transformed her entire face, that federal marshals can't seize evidence of a crime that the accused has already confessed doesn't exist. Whitfield can't claim theft of property he's admitted he stole in the first place. Attorney Marsh was reading through the telegram with the expression of a man watching his carefully constructed case collapse. Miss Mitchell, this is quite convenient timing for these revelations. Mr. Marsh, the timing is perfect because I've been pursuing this investigation for 8 months. Every document in my possession was gathered through legitimate legal channels and professional investigation. The fact that justice and timing have coincided shouldn't surprise anyone familiar with the concept of persistence. Sheriff Daly looked from the documents to the officials to Cole and Sarah, his expression reflecting the bewilderment of a man watching familiar problems transform into something entirely different. So where does this leave us? Are the federal marshals still coming? Judge Blackwood folded the telegram carefully and handed it back to Sarah. Miss Mitchell, assuming these documents are authenticated, and they appear to be quite thorough, your claim to ownership seems legally sound. Mr. Hart's rescue of abandoned animals becomes a rescue of your property, which you're obviously grateful for rather than prosecuting. Extremely grateful, Sarah confirmed. So grateful that I've offered Mr. Hart a partnership in a breeding operation that will keep the horses exactly where they are, under his continued care. Cole saw understanding dawn in Sheriff Daly's eyes, followed by relief that suggested the lawman had never been comfortable with the federal government's heavy-handed approach to what should have been a local matter. "Well then," Sheriff Daly said, "I guess I better send a telegram to those federal marshals. Tell them their services won't be needed after all." The telegraph key fell silent as James Miller finished transmitting the message that would cancel tomorrow's federal intervention. In the sudden quiet, Cole could hear the wind whistling through the buildings of Millbrook and the distant sound of his own horses shifting restlessly, ready to return to the warmth and security of the valley they'd come to call home. Sarah Mitchell's telegram lay folded in her hand like a small piece of justice finally delivered after months of patient pursuit. The federal government's case had collapsed, not through confrontation, but through the simple power of thorough preparation, meeting divine timing at exactly the right moment. Cole looked at Sarah, seeing her not as the stranger she'd been that morning, but as the partner she was offering to become. Together, they'd built something more powerful than either could have achieved alone, a legal foundation strong enough to protect the lives he'd rescued, and a future that honored both justice and compassion. The telegraph message had carried more than information across the wires. It had carried hope, vindication, and the promise that sometimes, when a man stood up for what was right, the whole universe conspired to help him succeed. The Winchester rifle had been Cole's father's weapon of choice during the territorial campaigns, a .44 40 caliber lever action that had never failed when lives depended on its accuracy. Cole had cleaned and maintained the rifle religiously since inheriting it, more from respect for his father's memory than from any expectation that he'd ever need to use it in anger. Now, as he checked the action one more time in the pre-dawn darkness of his cabin, he prayed that today wouldn't be the day that changed. Marcus Whitfield had escaped from federal custody. The news had reached them through Doc Henley's emergency ride from town, the old physician pushing his horse harder than was safe through the mountain darkness. Federal marshals had been transferring Whitfield from San Francisco to Denver when their train was stopped by what appeared to be a routine landslide. But the landslide had been manufactured, the marshals had been overwhelmed by superior numbers, and Whitfield had disappeared into the night with men who had the resources and organization to plan a complex rescue operation. "He's not working alone," Doc had gasped out as he'd stumbled into Cole's cabin just after midnight. Marshall said there were at least 8 men involved, all armed with military precision. Someone with serious money is backing Whitfield's play. The implications were chilling. Whitfield's confession and cooperation with federal authorities had been a calculated performance, designed to neutralize the legal obstacles to reclaiming the horses while his accomplices arranged his escape. Now he was free to pursue his original plan, recovering valuable breeding stock that could fund his flight to whatever sanctuary money could buy. Sarah had taken the news with the composed determination that Cole was beginning to recognize as her response to crisis. While Doc caught his breath by the fire, she'd spread maps across Cole's table and begun planning defensive positions with the tactical awareness of someone who'd given serious thought to protecting valuable assets from armed men. "He'll come at dawn," she'd said quietly. "Standard outlaw tactic hit when people are still half asleep and hoping the night's troubles have passed with the darkness." Cole had asked the obvious question, "How do you know so much about outlaw tactics?" "Because my grandfather didn't just breed horses," Sarah had replied. "He also consulted with territorial authorities on livestock security. I grew up hearing stories about horse thieves and the methods they used. Whitfield's not just a failed rancher, he's a professional thief who's been planning this recovery for months." Now, as pale light began to filter through the cabin windows, Cole positioned himself at the window that offered the best view of the trail approaching from town. The Winchester was loaded and ready, with extra ammunition within easy reach. Sarah had taken position at the back window, armed with a Spencer carbine that she handled with competence that would have surprised men who underestimated her based on her refined appearance. Moonlight and her foals were in the lean-to shelter, protected by thick log walls that would stop anything short of artillery. The horses seemed to sense the tension in their human guardians, standing alert and watchful rather than dozing in their usual morning calm. Movement on the trail, Sarah called softly from her position. 4 riders, coming up the valley slowly. Cole squinted through the growing light, counting silhouettes against the snow-covered landscape. 4 riders, as Sarah had said. But something about their formation suggested coordination and purpose rather than casual approach. They were spreading out as they advanced, creating multiple angles of attack that would be difficult to defend against simultaneously. "They're not coming to negotiate," Cole murmured. "No," Sarah agreed. "They're coming to take what they want and eliminate any witnesses who might complicate their story later." The lead rider was close enough now for Cole to make out details. Marcus Whitfield, looking nothing like the desperate man who'd fled territorial justice weeks earlier. He sat his horse with confidence, wore clothes that suggested recent access to considerable funds, and carried himself like a man who'd never doubted his ability to take whatever he wanted. The other 3 riders were professionals. Cole could read it in their positioning, their alertness, the efficient way they controlled their mounts while keeping weapons ready for immediate use. These weren't frontier drifters looking for easy money. These were men who made their living through organized violence, the kind of hired guns that wealthy criminals employed when they needed problems eliminated permanently. Whitfield raised his hand when the group was still 100 yards out, bringing his companions to a halt while he studied Cole's cabin and the surrounding terrain. He was looking for defensive positions, counting potential threats, evaluating the tactical situation before committing to an approach that might prove costly. "Hart!" Whitfield's voice carried clearly across the cold morning air. "I know you're in there. I've come for my horses." Cole stepped into the doorway, the Winchester held ready but not directly threatening. "Your horses are long gone, Whitfield. Sold to pay your debts and transported to buyers who won't abandon them in blizzards. Don't lie to me, Hart. I know they're here. I know about the Mitchell woman and her fancy papers. But legal documents don't matter when you're dealing with men who don't recognize territorial authority." Sarah appeared at the back window, her Spencer carbine visible enough to make the hired guns shift nervously in their saddles. 4 against 2 wasn't impossible odds, but it was close enough to make professional killers think twice about the cost of their payday. "Whitfield," Sarah called out, "you've got no legal claim to those horses. Your confession to federal authorities invalidated any rights you might have had." Whitfield's laugh was harsh and bitter. "Miss Mitchell, you're thinking like someone who believes law and justice are the same thing. Out here, possession is the only law that matters, and I intend to possess what's mine." One of the hired guns, a lean man with the pale eyes of someone who'd killed often enough to stop counting, leaned over to whisper something in Whitfield's ear. Cole saw the rancher nod and gesture toward the cabin, clearly outlining a plan of attack that would overwhelm defensive positions through coordinated assault. "Hart," Whitfield called out again, "I'm going to give you one chance to be reasonable. Bring out my horses and the Mitchell woman, and I'll let you ride away. Refuse, and my associates will demonstrate why cooperation is in everyone's best interest." Cole felt the familiar calm that had always settled over him in moments of genuine crisis, the same steady focus that had served him during his army days when survival depended on clear thinking under pressure. He'd hoped to avoid violence, but some situations couldn't be resolved through negotiation or compromise. "Whitfield," he called back, "those horses were dying when I found them. You abandoned them to freeze, and now they belong to someone who actually cares whether they live or die. If you want them, you'll have to come through me." "So be it," Whitfield replied, and Cole heard the resignation of a man who'd exhausted his patience with civilized solutions. The attack came with professional precision. Two riders split off to approach the cabin from different angles, while Whitfield and the pale-eyed gunman provided covering fire from their original position. It was a classic pincer movement, designed to divide defensive attention and create multiple threats that couldn't be addressed simultaneously. Cole's first shot took down the rider approaching from the left, the Winchester's .44-40 round, punching through the man's shoulder and spinning him from his saddle. His horse shied and bolted, carrying its wounded rider back down the trail in a cloud of snow and confused terror. Sarah's Spencer cracked almost simultaneously, her shot aimed at the rider, circling toward the back of the cabin. She missed the man, but hit his horse, and the animal's scream of pain and terror echoed across the valley like a declaration of war. Return fire from Whitfield, and his companion sent splinters flying from the cabin's log walls, but the thick timber Cole's father had chosen for construction absorbed the impact without significant damage. The cabin had been built to withstand mountain weather and occasional visits from hostile wildlife, construction that served equally well against human predators. The dismounted rider from Sarah's successful horse shot was now approaching on foot, using the lean-to shelter as cover while he tried to work his way into position for a clear shot. Cole could see him moving through the gaps between the logs, a professional's careful advance that suggested military training and combat experience. "Sarah!" Cole called out. "Man coming up behind the lean-to." "I see him," she replied, and Cole heard the metallic click of her Spencer being reloaded. But the pale-eyed gunman had used the distraction to advance closer to the cabin's front wall, and his next shot spiderwebbed the window glass inches from Cole's head. Glass fragments drew blood from Cole's cheek, and he realized that their defensive position was becoming untenable. Professional killers with patience and superior numbers would eventually find angles that couldn't be defended from inside the cabin. Cole made the decision that his father would have made in similar circumstances. Sometimes the best defense was a carefully planned offense, and sometimes survival required taking risks that cautious men wouldn't accept. "Sarah," he called out, "when I give the signal, put everything you've got into that lean-to. Keep that man pinned down while I deal with the others. Cole, don't do anything stupid." "Define stupid," Cole replied, and heard her laugh despite the bullets flying around them. Cole counted to 3, then burst through the cabin door with the Winchester at his shoulder and his father's calm focus guiding his movements. The pale-eyed gunman was reloading, his attention momentarily divided between his weapon and Cole's unexpected appearance. Cole's shot took him center mass, the impact lifting him from his saddle and depositing him in the snow with the boneless finality of sudden death. Whitfield's horse reared as its rider fought to control both his mount and his rifle, and in that moment of confusion, Cole dove behind the woodpile that offered the only available cover between the cabin and the attackers. Bullets chewed splinters from the split logs above his head, but the seasoned wood held against everything Whitfield could deliver. Behind him, Sarah's Spencer spoke again and again, its rapid fire keeping the dismounted gunman pinned behind the lean-to, while Cole dealt with the immediate threat. The rhythm of her shooting suggested she'd found her target at least once, because the return fire from that direction had stopped entirely. Whitfield was alone now, one man against 2 defenders who'd proven they could shoot accurately under pressure. But he was also desperate, and desperate men with nothing left to lose could be more dangerous than professionals who calculated odds before committing to action. "Hart!" Whitfield screamed, his voice cracking with rage and desperation. "Those horses are worth more than your life, more than both your lives. I won't let you steal my future." Cole rose from behind the woodpile with the Winchester steady in his hands, its barrel trained on the man who'd abandoned 3 innocent animals to die, and then returned with killers to reclaim them as property. The range was close enough to count the buttons on Whitfield's coat, close enough to see the madness in his eyes that came from months of running and hiding and planning, revenge against people who'd simply done what was right. "Whitfield," Cole said quietly. "Drop your rifle and ride away. This doesn't have to end with anyone else dying." For a moment, Marcus Whitfield seemed to consider the offer. His rifle wavered in his hands, and Cole saw the calculating look of a man weighing his remaining options against the inevitable consequences of continued resistance. Then Whitfield's face hardened into the expression of someone who'd chosen to gamble everything on one final desperate play. His rifle swung toward Cole with the quick desperation of a man who knew he was beaten but refused to accept defeat. Cole's Winchester spoke once more, its voice echoing across the snow-covered valley like a final judgment on the choices that had brought them all to this moment of violence and resolution. The bloodied bandana had been white when Cole tied it around his neck that morning, a simple piece of cotton meant to keep the winter wind from finding the gap between his collar and his coat. Now it was stained crimson from the bullet graze across his left shoulder, the fabric serving as an improvised bandage while Sarah worked to stop the bleeding that could have been so much worse. Marcus Whitfield lay motionless in the snow where Cole's final shot had dropped him, his rifle fallen from nerveless fingers and his eyes staring sightlessly at the pale morning sky. There was no satisfaction in the sight, no sense of victory or justice served. Only the grim acknowledgement that some men chose their own endings through the decisions they made when conscience and greed pulled in opposite directions. "Hold still," Sarah murmured, her hands gentle but efficient as she cleaned the wound that Whitfield's last desperate shot had carved across Cole's shoulder. "The bullet just creased you, but it's bleeding more than I'd like. We need to get you to Doc Henley." Cole winced as she tightened the bandana around his shoulder, but the pain was manageable, nothing compared to the ache of knowing that violence had been the only solution to a problem that should never have existed. What about the others? Sarah glanced toward the lean-to where one of Whitfield's hired guns lay unconscious, his leg shattered by her Spencer's accuracy. The man Cole had shot first was sitting propped against a tree, his wounded shoulder rendering him harmless but alive. The pale-eyed killer would never threaten anyone again. "Two will live, one won't," Sarah said matter-of-factly. "The wounded ones are professionals who were paid to do a job. Without Whitfield to pay them, they'll have no reason to continue his fight." She was right, but Cole felt the weight of responsibility for everything that had happened in his peaceful valley. 3 men shot, 1 dead, blood staining the snow that had seemed so pristine just hours earlier. The cost of protecting 3 horses had turned out to be higher than anyone should have had to pay. From the lean-to came the soft nickering of moonlight, calling to her foals, the mare's voice carrying maternal concern rather than fear. The horses had weathered the gunfight with the steady calm that marked animals who'd learned to trust their human protectors completely. Whatever violence had erupted around them, they seemed to understand that Cole and Sarah had been fighting to keep them safe. "We need to send word to Sheriff Daly," Cole said, struggling to his feet, despite Sarah's protests about rest and proper medical attention. "There'll be questions about what happened here, investigations, maybe federal involvement again." "There will," Sarah agreed, "but this time the evidence speaks for itself. Whitfield escaped from federal custody, assembled a gang of hired killers, and attacked your property with deadly force. Any investigation will show that you defended yourself and my legitimate claim to the horses." She was probably right, but Cole had lived long enough to know that legal truth and investigative conclusions didn't always align perfectly. The fact that he'd killed a man, even a man who'd been trying to kill him, would bring scrutiny from authorities who might view the entire situation differently than the people who'd lived through it. The sound of approaching horses drew their attention to the trail leading up from town. Cole's hand moved instinctively toward his Winchester before he recognized the steady rhythm of riders who weren't trying to approach stealthily. Sheriff Daly appeared first, followed by Doc Henley and 2 men Cole didn't recognize, but whose badges and professional bearing marked them as federal marshals. "Looks like news travels fast," Sarah observed, helping Cole settle back onto the cabin steps where Doc could examine his wound properly. Sheriff Daly surveyed the scene with the expression of a man who'd seen enough violence to read its story in the positions of bodies and the patterns of blood in snow. His eyes lingered on Whitfield's corpse, then moved to the wounded gunman, then finally to Cole and Sarah, sitting beside the cabin that had become an impromptu fortress. "Cole," the sheriff said quietly, "you all right?" "I'll live," Cole replied. "Can't say the same for everyone who rode up here this morning." One of the federal marshals, a tall man with grey hair and the weathered face of someone who'd spent decades tracking criminals across difficult country, dismounted and approached Whitfield's body. He knelt beside the dead man, checking for signs of life that everyone already knew wouldn't be there. "Marcus Whitfield," the marshal said, standing and brushing snow from his knees, "wanted for interstate fraud, conspiracy, escape from federal custody, and now attempted murder. Mr. Hart, it appears you've solved several of our problems simultaneously." Doc Henley was examining Cole's shoulder with the careful thoroughness that had made him the most trusted physician in 3 counties. "Clean wound," he pronounced. "Bullet barely creased you, but you'll want to keep it clean and avoid heavy lifting for a week or 2. The second marshal was questioning the wounded gunman, his notebook filling with details that would undoubtedly become part of an official report. Cole caught fragments of their statements, admissions of being hired for a specific job, denials of knowing anything about Whitfield's larger criminal activities, the usual self-serving testimony of men trying to minimize their legal exposure. "Marshal Thompson," Sarah said, addressing the gray-haired federal officer, "I assume you'll want to examine the documentation regarding ownership of the horses Whitfield was trying to steal." "Yes, ma'am, we will," Thompson replied. "Though given the circumstances of his death and his escape from custody, I suspect the federal government's interest in this case has been largely resolved. Dead men don't stand trial, and living victims of attempted murder don't usually face charges for defending themselves." Sheriff Daly nodded agreement. "This looks like a clear case of self-defense to me." Whitfield brought armed men to Cole's property with the obvious intention of taking the horses by force. What happened next was entirely his responsibility. Cole felt some of the tension that had been building in his chest begin to ease. The legal complications he'd been dreading might prove less severe than he'd feared. Official investigations could still be time-consuming and stressful, but the basic facts of the case seemed clear enough to avoid prolonged uncertainty. "There's something else," Sarah said, producing yet another document from her seemingly inexhaustible supply of legal papers. Daniel Walsh's investigation uncovered evidence that Whitfield was planning to leave the country once he recovered the horses. Bank records show recent large deposits from sources linked to criminal organizations in Mexico and California. Marshal Thompson accepted the document with interest. "Miss Mitchell, your detective friend has been quite thorough. This suggests Whitfield's escape was financed by people who expected a substantial return on their investment." "Return that they'll never see now," Sarah replied with satisfaction. Doc Henley finished bandaging Cole's shoulder and stepped back to admire his work. "You'll heal clean if you're sensible about caring for it." Though I suspect sensible and Cole Hart aren't always found in the same sentence. Despite everything that had happened, Cole found himself smiling. "Doc, I've been plenty sensible. I just define it differently than some folks might." The federal marshals spent another hour documenting the scene and taking statements from everyone involved. Their questions were thorough but not hostile, and Cole got the impression they viewed the morning's events as a satisfactory conclusion to a case that had caused them considerable frustration. The wounded gunmen were loaded onto a wagon for transport to town, where they'd receive medical treatment before being transferred to federal custody for trial on various charges related to Whitfield's escape and the morning's attack. Neither seemed inclined to cause further trouble. Professional criminals understood when a job had gone irreversibly wrong. Whitfield's body was wrapped in canvas and placed beside his former associates, a final journey that would end in a territorial grave rather than the sanctuary he'd been seeking. Cole felt no satisfaction in the sight, only the melancholy that came from witnessing the final chapter of a life that had taken so many wrong turns. As the official party prepared to leave, Sheriff Daly lingered for a private word with Cole. "You know there'll be more paperwork, more questions, maybe a territorial hearing about the use of deadly force." "I know," Cole replied. "I'm prepared for whatever comes next." "Good, because there's something else you should know. Word of this morning's events is going to spread, and not everyone will see it the way we do." Whitfield had connections, people who might view his death as something requiring revenge rather than justice. Cole felt the weight of new concerns settling over him like a familiar burden. "Are you saying this isn't over?" "I'm saying be careful," Sheriff Daly replied. "You've made some powerful enemies today, even if you've also resolved some serious problems. Keep your eyes open and your rifle close until we're sure all of Whitfield's associates have been accounted for." After the official party departed, Cole and Sarah stood in the sudden quiet of their valley, watching the sun climb higher over peaks that had witnessed violence and resolution in equal measure. The snow around the cabin was stained with blood that would melt away with the next warm weather, but the memory of the morning's events would remain as permanent as the scars Cole's wound would leave. The bloodied bandana around his shoulder had darkened from bright red to rusty brown, its fabric holding the proof of how close the morning had come to ending very differently. But it also represented survival, the price paid for standing up to men who believed that want and violence were sufficient justification for taking whatever they desired. Moonlight and her foals emerged from the lean-to as calm returned to their world. The mare investigating the scattered debris of the morning's conflict, while her babies resumed their endless exploration of everything within reach. They seemed untroubled by the violence that had swirled around them, focused instead on the simple certainties of food and warmth and the protection offered by the humans who'd proven willing to fight for their safety. "It's finished," Sarah said quietly, but Cole heard the question in her statement. "This part is," he replied, watching the horses move through their familiar routines. "But there'll be other challenges, other people who see them as property instead of lives worth protecting." "Then we'll face those challenges together," Sarah said, and Cole heard the promise in her words that partnership meant more than shared ownership. It meant shared responsibility for whatever came next. The bloodied bandana would heal, as wounds always did given time and proper care. But the choices that had led to this morning's violence would continue to shape their lives in ways neither of them could fully predict. Some decisions, once made, created obligations that lasted far beyond the immediate moment of choice. Cole touched the bandana gently, feeling the damp warmth of blood that had already begun to clot. The price of standing up for what was right had been paid in pain and violence, but it had also been paid willingly by people who understood that some things were worth defending, regardless of the cost. The morning's battle was over, but the longer war for justice and compassion in a harsh world would continue as long as there were people willing to fight for those who couldn't fight for themselves. Spring had come early to the valley, melting the last traces of snow that might have reminded visitors of the violence that had stained the white landscape 3 months earlier. The new halter hung on a peg beside Cole's cabin door, its leather still stiff with newness, and its brass fittings bright with the promise of gentler purposes than the iron brand that now gathered dust in his kitchen drawer. Sarah had commissioned the halter from the finest leatherworker in Denver, its design elegant but practical, crafted for a mare who deserved better treatment than she'd received from men who saw her only as valuable property. The nameplate read "Moonlight" in flowing script, but below that, in smaller letters, were the words "Rescued by Cole Hart." February 1893, a permanent reminder of the night when one man's conscience had overcome winter's attempt to claim 3 innocent lives. The partnership between Cole and Sarah had evolved into something neither had quite expected when they'd first shaken hands over legal documents and shared determination to protect the horses they'd both come to love. What had begun as a practical arrangement to resolve ownership issues had grown into a genuine collaboration built on mutual respect and shared values that went far deeper than mere business convenience. The horse ranch they'd established together bore no resemblance to the grandiose enterprises that wealthy Eastern investors sometimes imposed on Western landscapes. Instead, it reflected the practical wisdom of people who understood that successful breeding required patience, careful attention to individual animals, and the kind of daily care that couldn't be delegated to hired hands who lacked personal investment in the outcome. Moonlight's foals had grown into magnificent yearlings, their bloodlines expressing themselves in ways that vindicated Thomas Mitchell's faith in careful genetic selection. The chestnut, whom they'd named Dakota in honor of his birth during the blizzard, showed the intelligence and athletic ability that marked superior saddle horses. His darker brother Storm displayed the speed and grace that suggested a future in racing circles, though Cole had insisted that any competition would wait until the young horse was mature enough to handle the pressures without psychological damage. Cole stood in the morning sunlight outside his cabin, watching the horses graze in the meadow that Sarah's investment had converted from wild grassland into managed pasture. The sight of them moving freely across their domain, healthy and content and secure in their place in the world, provided a satisfaction that went beyond anything he'd experienced during his years of solitary existence. Doc Henley's approach was announced by the familiar sound of his horse's steady gait and the doctor's habit of humming old army songs when he was pleased with the world. The physician had become a regular visitor to the ranch, partly from professional interest in Cole's complete recovery from his gunshot wound, but mostly from genuine friendship and his fascination with the transformation of his former patient from isolated drifter to successful partner in a growing enterprise. "Morning, Cole," Doc called out as he dismounted. "Sarah around this morning?" "She's in Denver, meeting with potential buyers for some of Dakota's offspring when he's old enough to breed," Cole replied. "Should be back this afternoon with news about whether those California horse people are as interested as they claim to be." "Good for her, and good for you. This place is starting to look like a real ranch instead of a hermit's hideout." Cole smiled at the gentle teasing. Doc was right. The addition of Sarah's business acumen and financial resources had transformed his simple cabin and lean-to into the nucleus of an operation that was beginning to attract attention from serious horse breeders across the territories. But the changes went deeper than mere physical expansion. "Doc," Cole said, "you remember that conversation we had last winter when you asked me what I was running from out here?" "I remember you telling me it was none of my business," Doc replied with a grin. "Well, maybe it was your business after all, or maybe it just took me a while to figure out that I wasn't running from something I was looking for, something I didn't know how to name." Doc studied Cole's face with the careful attention he gave to patients whose symptoms were changing in significant ways. "And did you find it?" Cole gestured toward the meadow, where Moonlight was teaching her yearlings the fine points of establishing dominance within the herd structure. "I found purpose, Doc. Not the kind that comes from doing what you're supposed to do, but the kind that comes from doing what you're called to do, even when it's inconvenient, even when it's dangerous." "Purpose," Doc repeated thoughtfully. "That's a powerful medicine, Cole. Probably the only cure for the kind of wounds you were carrying when you first came to this valley." They were interrupted by the sound of approaching riders, 3 horses moving at the easy pace of people who weren't in any particular hurry, but had somewhere specific they intended to go. Cole recognized Sheriff Daly's silhouette before the lawman was close enough for conversation, but the other 2 riders were strangers, whose purpose Cole couldn't immediately determine. "Tom," Cole called out as the sheriff approached, "you're a long way from town for a social visit." "Official business, I'm afraid," Sheriff Daly replied, though his tone suggested nothing immediately threatening. "Cole, I'd like you to meet Judge Patricia Thornton from the Territorial Capital, and Michael Harrison, who represents the Territorial Legislature's Committee on Livestock Regulations." Cole shook hands with both visitors, noting Judge Thornton's firm grip and direct gaze. and Harrison's slightly nervous manner that suggested a man more comfortable with paperwork than frontier ranches. Their presence undoubtedly meant complications of some kind, but Cole had learned to approach such situations with calm interest rather than defensive suspicion. "What can I do for you folks?" Cole asked. Judge Thornton dismounted with the efficient movements of someone accustomed to official travel across difficult country. "Mr. Hart, we're here because your case has attracted considerable attention from territorial authorities interested in establishing legal precedents for similar situations." "Precedents?" "The rescue and protection of abandoned livestock," Michael Harrison explained, consulting a leather portfolio that seemed to contain extensive documentation. "Your actions during the blizzard and the subsequent legal resolution of ownership questions have been studied as a model for how such cases might be handled in the future." Doc Henley leaned against his horse with the expression of someone settling in to enjoy an interesting conversation. "Are you saying Cole's become famous in legal circles?" "In a sense, yes," Judge Thornton replied. "The territorial legislature is considering new statutes that would formalize the rights and responsibilities of citizens who rescue abandoned animals. Your case provides an excellent example of how individual conscience and legal requirements can be balanced to serve both justice and practical necessity." Cole felt a familiar wariness at the mention of legal formalization. "What kind of statutes?" Harrison opened his portfolio and withdrew several official-looking documents. Proposed legislation that would establish clear procedures for the rescue and temporary custody of abandoned livestock, with specific protections for rescuers acting in good faith and clear pathways for determining legitimate ownership when original claims are contested. "In other words," Sheriff Daly said with a slight smile, "they want to make sure the next person who finds dying horses in a blizzard doesn't have to face the same legal complications you did." Judge Thornton nodded agreement. "Exactly. Your willingness to stand up for what you believed was right, despite significant legal and personal risks, has demonstrated that individual conscience can serve the public interest when supported by appropriate legal frameworks." Cole looked toward the meadow, where Moonlight and her yearlings continued their peaceful grazing, their contentment a visible reminder of how the entire complicated situation had originated. "What do you need from me?" "Testimony," Harrison explained. "Your account of the rescue, the decision-making process you went through, the challenges you faced, and the outcome you achieved. The legislature wants to hear from someone who actually lived through the experience, rather than just studying it from legal documents." "When?" "Next month, if you're willing," Judge Thornton said. "The territorial capital, formal hearing, opportunity to influence legislation that could affect similar situations for years to come." Cole considered the request, weighing his natural preference for privacy against the possibility of helping other people who might find themselves in circumstances similar to what he'd faced. The idea of formal testimony and legislative hearings held little appeal, but the thought of preventing others from facing the legal harassment he'd endured had considerable merit. "I'll do it," he said finally, "but I want Sarah Mitchell to testify as well. Her role in resolving the ownership questions was just as important as my role in the rescue itself." "Of course," Judge Thornton agreed. "Miss Mitchell's documentation and detective work provided crucial precedents for how fraudulent ownership claims can be challenged and overturned." After the official party departed with promises to send formal invitations and detailed information about the legislative hearing, Cole found himself alone with Doc Henley and the quiet satisfaction that came from knowing his actions might have consequences beyond the immediate situation they'd been designed to address. "You realize what this means?" Doc asked. "It means I'll have to wear my good clothes and be polite to politicians," Cole replied. "It means you've become the kind of man who influences how justice works, instead of just hoping it'll work in your favor." Doc corrected. "That's quite a transformation for someone who came to this valley looking to hide from the world." That afternoon, Sarah returned from Denver with news that confirmed their ranch's growing reputation among serious horse breeders. The California investors were indeed interested in Dakota's future offspring, and preliminary inquiries from Kentucky and Virginia suggested that Moonlight's bloodlines were attracting national attention. "We're going to need to expand," Sarah said, as they walked through the meadow where the horses had gathered for their evening feeding. "More pasture, better facilities, maybe additional breeding stock if we can find animals that meet our standards." Cole nodded, but his attention was focused on Moonlight, who had approached as they talked and was now investigating the new halter Sarah carried. The mare's calm acceptance of human presence, her willingness to trust despite everything she'd endured, continued to amaze him. "She's been through abandonment, near death, violence, and legal battles," Cole observed, "but she still believes in the possibility of good treatment from the people around her." "Animals forgive more easily than humans," Sarah replied, slipping the new halter over Moonlight's head with gentle efficiency. "They judge by present behavior rather than past disappointments." The brass nameplate caught the evening light, its inscription a permanent reminder of the February night when rescue had seemed impossible but had been attempted anyway. Cole ran his fingers over the leather, feeling its supple strength, and thinking about the symbolic significance of replacing Whitfield's cut halter with something that represented care rather than abandonment. "Sarah," he said, "Doc tells me that Judge Thornton wants both of us to testify about how this whole situation played out." "I heard. Are you comfortable with that kind of public attention?" Cole looked around the valley that had become home to more than just himself, seeing the evidence of lives rebuilt and purposes discovered through the simple act of refusing to walk past suffering when action was possible. "I'm comfortable with doing whatever it takes to make sure other people in similar situations don't have to face the same obstacles we did," he said. "If that means testifying in front of politicians and having our story become part of legal precedent, then that's what we'll do." The new halter represented more than just replacement equipment. It represented the difference between the life Moonlight had known under Whitfield's ownership and the life she'd found under the protection of people who valued her, for more than her breeding potential. But it also represented the transformation that had occurred in Cole himself, from a man who'd isolated himself from responsibility to one who'd accepted the challenges that came with caring about outcomes beyond his own immediate comfort. As the sun set over the mountains that enclosed their valley, Cole watched the horses settle into their evening routines with the calm confidence of animals who knew they were safe, valued, and protected by humans who considered their care a privilege rather than a burden. The new halter gleamed in the fading light, its brass fittings reflecting the promise of gentler treatment and the hope that justice, once achieved, could be preserved through the simple determination of people willing to stand up for what they believed was right. The fight for Moonlight and her foals was over, but the larger battle for a world where compassion and law worked together instead of against each other would continue as long as there were people brave enough to risk everything for the sake of creatures who couldn't protect themselves. Sometimes, Cole reflected, the smallest decisions carried the largest consequences. The choice to climb down from Buck's back during a howling blizzard had led to partnership, purpose, and the possibility that his story might help others facing similar moments when conscience and convenience pulled in opposite directions. The new halter would weather and soften with use, but its inscription would remain as permanent as the changes that rescue and commitment had brought to all their lives. In the end, Cole thought, that might be the only kind of immortality that really mattered, the knowledge that standing up for what was right had made a difference that would outlast the people who'd made the choice to act when action was needed most.